So it's not there. So next question is by RD Nayak. So Ravindra, please ask your question in the chat. Please unmute yourself and ask the question.
Just just a moment. I am trying to figure out where it is in the chat session because it has rolled up.
Another chat. So I will just mention the question. Prant, you mentioned hard benchmarks were selected for evaluation. What is hard or how did you decide which benchmarks were hard? So by RD.
Yeah, so hard benchmarks. So first we ran the vanilla stratified inlining on all these HD benchmarks. So there were around 11,000 of them. So obviously the benchmarks which were verified within 1 or 2 seconds were not hard. So as a criteria, we selected as whichever benchmarks Coral took more than 200 seconds to solve or timed out, those we considered as hard benchmarks.
Okay, thanks.
So next question was by Shavik to Prantik, but then I think Prantik has answered it. In case Shavik wants to ask it, please go ahead. I don't hear Shavik, so let's move on to the next. So next question is by Arpit to Sangu. So Arpit, would you like to ask it or should I read it? Okay, so I think Arpit is not there, so I will read it. Sangu, the tuning technique looks somewhat similar to partial order reduction. Of course, you do it for different states while your focuses on branches from the same state. What are your views?
Yeah, Amay, thank you for the question and thanks Arpit for the question. So basically for state interpolation, partial order reduction is actually required. So there is a paper in 2007 or 2009 by Jackson, and there is a very good comparison with partial order and state interpolation. So but what actually today I presented with interpolation technique, so we usually let's say implemented interpolation technique on top of dynamic symbolic execution tool CLI. Okay, so basically what we do, we actually generate let's say interpolants from one branch and another branch, and we collect at the let's say that program point, and that considered to be the full interpolation in full interpolant formulas. Okay, so somehow the concepts are actually related to that, but in traditional one, dynamic symbolic execution engine was not there, but in our new system TracerX we have. So if answer is not satisfied, so we can have it offline also. Yeah.
Amay, may I request that all the speakers and yourself be on video also, if you don't mind?
Oh, okay. So yeah, that might be a good idea. So I'm putting myself on speaker, and I would request all the speakers of the session to be on video as well. So right now I don't see any other question on chat. I have 3 hand raises. So if I have missed your question on chat, please raise your hand and I will take it up. So next question is by Subodh. He has raised his hand, so I request him to ask his question. And he can also turn on his video for a moment if he wants.
No, that's fine. Thanks, Amay. Prantik, nice talk. Interesting problem. I have a question. So you said that when you increase the number of clients, of course, you could solve higher number of instances, verification instances. But it's also known that with increasing the number of clients or nodes on which you can exploit the parallelism, your concurrency overheads also increase. So I was curious to understand what was the impact on your average speed up. You had shown it to be 20x on certain number of clients, but if you increase the number of clients, your speed up would have been impacted. And I'm sort of curious if you did those experiments.
Yeah, right. So for these concurrency overheads, we already have the server optimizations in place. So essentially, consider this example. Let's say client 1 is working on verifying a partition. Now it has inlined some call sites A, B, C, then decides to split on some call site B, then goes on to inline some other call sites. Now, when you push these partitions to the server, when another partition picks up, when another client picks up these partitions, it has to essentially reset its own prover stack and then push these assertions and these split decisions onto its prover stack. So this reset and initialization are all these concurrency overheads. So the optimizations ensure that the concurrency overheads are small. So essentially, a client is always prioritized for its own partitions that it has pushed onto the server. And also, so this is one thing that I couldn't talk in the presentation because there was not so much time. So the queues so each client maintain its own double-ended queue. So whenever you push a partition onto this own double-ended queue, so the partitions goes in. At first, you have the shallow partitions where there are lesser number of inlinings. Then slowly you have partitions which has more number of inlinings. So the deeper partitions are picked up by the client which has sent these partitions, and the shallow partitions are allocated to another client. So in this way, we reduce the concurrency overhead. So we didn't actually perform the experiment that you are talking about. So we don't know the impact of the concurrency overhead, but the optimizations should reduce it.
Thanks, Prantik. I have just one follow-up comment. It's not really a question. There has been a very interesting work few years back published in Supercomputing 2015 on approvably work-efficient parallelization for unordered depth-first search. And I think when you explore that verification tree, you are performing some sort of unordered depth-first search on that on that tree, and I think that paper might be relevant to you. So just a comment. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hello. Amir, you are on mute actually. Yeah.
So as I said, my system, I am using a different system. It is lagging. So by the time I click it twice, it again goes back to mute. Okay.
Yeah, actually, I have a related question to what
Okay, so
both asked.
next
Can I jump in now, or should I wait till my chance?
So is this Sonu who is the speaker? I'm not able to.
No, I'm Jyoti. I'm Jyoti.
Jyoti. Okay, so
Yes.
please, okay, I will request you raise your hand, and I can, because otherwise difficult to find out. So yes,
Yes.
Jyoti, go ahead. I think not many questions we should do. Yes, Jyoti, please go ahead.
Yeah. So Prantik, related to what Subodh asked, right? So for one client, when you have one client, what is the performance? I mean, the timings that are taken by your Hydra tool compared to Coral, like that will also tell you like performance overheads, right? So when you say one client, it's I think similar setup to what Coral has. And on the related note, the second question is you also told that you are taking those instances which could not be solved by Coral and then you solved it. But in one of your pie chart, it shows that 4% of so there's 4% difference where Coral solved some things and you did not solve. So that's actually confusing. Like, I mean, how can Coral solve something that you could not solve? Like, can you clarify on these two?
Yeah. So the hard benchmarks we took were those benchmarks where Coral either takes more than 200 seconds to solve or times up. So yeah, there were a few cases which Coral could solve, but Hydra could not. So these could be due to a lot of reasons. Because let's say, we have already seen that when you run Hydra with one client, it's slower than Coral because you are splitting these partitions, then you are evaluating these partitions sequentially. So guessing what the SMT solver is doing is actually very hard. So that's why there are very few cases where Coral wins over Hydra. But this is not a cause for concern because see, when you run Hydra with 32 clients, you could always run a Coral instance in parallel. So in that case, you can always take the best of both worlds.
Okay. So next, I would request Raghu to ask his question.
Okay. Thank you. So this is a a general question, but more, focused towards Sonu and her talk, right? So a lot of times, we keep talking about model repositories and configuration management with respect to repositories, etc., right? Now, on the other side, there's a problem with designers and designs that we never even talk about with respect to version control, with respect to repositories, right? I want to hear your thoughts, not just at the code level, right? Because as researchers, and again, I shouldn't be saying this, but unfortunately it's true. We always go for the easiest thing first, right? So what do you think about configurations with respect to designs?
Thanks for asking this question, Raghu. I'm not sure if I understand it completely, but how exactly do you define designs?
Just not text.
Sorry?
Something that's not textual.
I see. Okay. So when the technique that we are using is kind of generic, and I believe it is applicable to designs as well. I think what we are doing is we are just using a high-level approach where we, based on historical data, we see these two files are getting changed together by developers. Now, if they forget making, if they make change in one file but they forget the correlated file, then we are going to recommend it. So this approach is, I guess, is a very simplistic approach, and it can be applied to any file, regardless of whether it's a text file or code file or design file. But the reason I talked about configuration files is because when we deployed the system, we deployed it in all the files, and we realized that it was not working for a majority of files, especially the code files, and it turned out to be very effective for configuration files. And the reason for that was for code files, usually when developers write code, they will compile it, they will build it, and then only they will commit it. And our system was working at pull request level. So if there are some issues before that, let's say that the code is not getting built or something like that, the developers will make change and then they commit to a pull request. But configuration files are such that they are not really built. So that's where we found our system to be effective. Does that answer your question, or?
Yeah, in part, but I'm trying to understand rather, ultimately it all comes down to textual descriptions of whatever we have, right? For example, if you leave computer science people, right, and move to design people, right,
Mm-hmm.
and they're actually just talking about figures and different versions of figures which have changes. Now, how do we start capturing those is a very difficult question. And I was just trying to see if there's some insights that your research team is working on with respect to design side of things, not the computing side of things.
I see. Okay, got it. Sorry, yeah, no, we haven't really explored that space yet, but I think that's an interesting idea. Maybe we can think about it more. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So I think we are now in the round 2 of questions because I see Ravindra Nayak's hand raised again. So Ravindra, please go ahead.
Yeah. Thanks, Samir. Just continuing on with Sonu, I just had one question. It's an interesting approach that you have. So you mentioned about trying to use program synthesis, and I was just curious to know what you have in mind in terms of using program synthesis as an approach for handling more complex or different areas of this configuration changes.
Yeah, I think very good question. Yeah, so we realized it. So right now what we're doing is when developer changes X and we recommend, oh, you should go and change file Y. But we do not really tell developer what are they supposed to make change in file Y. And given that the file is so big, sometimes developer just gets confused, like, why are we asking them to make a change? So now our next step is we want them, we basically want to give them a fix or the exact change that needs to be made in file Y. So in the example that I talked about, we saw that there was a version update for one reference, and we expect the same version to be updated in file Y. Now, how do we figure that out? That's where we're trying to use techniques like PROS, where we look at the historical changes for file X and Y, and then try to synthesize a program. Like when when the version in file X is incremented by 1, we expect the version in file Y to be incremented by 1. And we do that, we use that program synthesis to generate the edit and actually give that edit back to the developer so that he or she doesn't have to worry about what needs to be changed in file, the suggested file.
Okay. Yeah, great. Interesting example. Thanks.
Thank you.
So, Amey, I have one more, one question for Devika. Can I go ahead or shall I wait?
Yes, I think I only see Subodh's head. I think he won't mind. So please go ahead, and then Subodh will be the next one.
Yeah. So, Devika, I have kind of two questions for you. One was, I was just trying to understand whether your stuff, the tests that you pick up, whether they are black box tests or white box tests, or your techniques don't really care whether they are black box or white box. It would kind of try and absorb all of them.
Yeah, so the technique, I would treat it more on the black box side because we are not really working on the implementation part to generate test cases. We are just simply picking up the test methods and just trying to make it in a form which is compatible with the query function that is being fed by the user. So yeah, so there is no source code involved as such. I mean, the only part of source is the test implementation and not the actual functionality implementation.
Okay, thanks. The second question I had for you was, you mentioned about trying to find out these similar functions in different libraries, and you talked about a little bit of method, what you called as match extraction. So I was trying to understand whether this match extraction was kind of completely automated in your case, or you kind of put in some human in the loop process also to maybe improve the suggestions that were being made by match extraction. Did you try and look at already existing methods like text summarizers or things like that for doing this match extraction?
So this match extraction component was fully automated. In fact, when I refer to similar functions, there can be a variety of similarities. There can be exact same functionality. In fact, another nature of similarity that we noticed was the inclusion relation. So often you have one function performing very specific functionality, and then there's another function which is a slightly generic form of that functionality, but essentially the basics are the same, and you can actually make use of some of that superset test cases to test the other functionality which is doing a very specific task. So and since we're dealing with the documentation and other textual data, we simply did the automated approach. Of course, we did the validation, which was manual, but for instance, for like I mentioned in the approach, we are trying to classify the match using a pre-trained decision tree classifier. So that pre-training, so to get that training set, of course, we had to perform manual labeling to get whether it's a valid match or not. And then the tested part was, fully automated.
Okay. So in that case, then I have a follow-up question that since this match extraction was being done automatically, how much variation, or we could even take it offline, how much variation was there in the parameter types or in the actual number of parameters? Because if these are automated matches, of course this automation is based on the description. I would tend to think that since it's automated, most of your functions would be almost exactly similar, and so would you really get any variations in parameters, numbers, or types, or anything else?
Okay, so that's an interesting one. In fact, there were a lot of insights that we explored in this process. So firstly, since we are dealing with a cross-language approach where it's quite possible that the query function was defined from some Python library, whereas the match candidate is coming from a library implemented in Java. So there can be type differences. That's like one thing. And in fact, there were variations pertaining to the such as the inclusion relation. So if I take some example, so there was some functionality, a query functionality, which was to come up with a function candidate that can validate an IPv4 address. Whereas, so the candidate match that we got for that one was implemented in Java, and it was by the name is INET address. So the subtle difference being that the query is
only expecting test cases for IPv4 addresses, while the candidate function returned is like a parent function which can validate an IPv4 as well as an IPv6. So it's a more generic form. So there were challenges pertaining to extracting just the relevant kind of test cases. You do not want to feed in test cases which are IPv6 addresses. So that's where we try to perform some structural matching on the test cases to see so that we feed the relevant IPv4 addresses only. So those were some pre-processings that we did.
Okay. Thanks, Devika.
Okay, so RD took his chance and then asked 3 questions instead of 1. So, but now, I will have to ask Subodh to go ahead with his question. And after that, we have Nanda Kumar who has posted on chat. So, Subodh, please ask your question.
Yeah, thanks, Amay. Devika, thanks for that nice talk. I really like that work. My question is on the methodology. I just wanted to understand, were there any showstoppers if I were to use more formal techniques to gather the summaries from the test implementations? And in your opinion, if in your opinion, why would, if formal techniques were not suitable, why would they not work? What would be the real showstoppers?
So I'm sure there is a lot of scope for applying formal techniques there. So what we sort of proposed here is leveraging the test mining from the perspective of generating test cases. So this is a very early stage work that we've presented, and in fact that opens a domain of problems. So one problem that I see where probably formal methods might be useful is addressing the test oracle problem. So what our tool Metallicus does is it can aptly give you relevant test inputs which the user can test with, but it does not guarantee that if there is an assertion failure, it guarantees a bug resolution. So that's because there are a lot of challenges pertaining to that as well. So if you recall the example that I had given on the pause tagger, so there the tag, one library was tagging it as a noun, while the other one can have a whole different representation of a tag. So for instance, NNS is another representation for tagging plural nouns. So it's possible that the output type can be different, its representation might be different. So that is something where we can probably apply some techniques to making use of the source code to see what is the semantically equivalent output there. So yeah, that's probably one idea where I see we can apply certain techniques.
Sorry, my network connection has not been very good, so perhaps I'll take this offline because I could not hear most of your answer. So maybe offline we can discuss this. But thanks.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we have a question from Nanda Kumar ji. So Nanda Kumar, can you ask? And this question is for Sonu.
Yeah. Can I talk orally?
Yes, please go ahead.
Actually, we have in our ISRO, we have systems like we have a scheduler which is running multiple executable files depending on different types of products that are to be generated. And we have configuration files for the scheduler and plus configuration files for each executable. They lie in different directories and different places. And maybe configuration files are identified with the extension CFG or something like that. But still they are lying in different directories, and without changing stopping the system, how do you change you said it is possible by configuration files, you can change without stopping the system, you can make changes and still without make the system run without stopping. That how do you do it in different, you allow the system, allow your program, your configuration changes when you make. How do you identify which different configuration files, the whole gamut of configuration files which are there for different executables? How do you identify and how to make it known to your software?
I see.
Are you getting me?
Sorry.
Are you getting me?
I partly got the question. So I think I can probably answer how do we identify configuration files. Basically, we are using extensions for it right now. And within Microsoft, we saw there are about 500 extensions that people are using, and we're limiting our analysis to about top 5 or 10 extensions, and which follow a particular structure, which is mostly XML. So we are concentrating our analysis on that, and the way we selected those files was based on the frequency of edits. So this is one part, but I think the second part that you talked about, like how do we make the system running continuously, and at the same time we make changes to configuration files. Is that correct?
Right.
Yeah, so I guess that's something probably we do not really care about. The idea is this is what we have got by talking to people or by talking to developers. So they have a set of code files. When they make changes to the code, they build it, but at the same time they have another folder where they have these configuration files. And they keep changing configuration files, let's say values of some config settings, but that doesn't mean that they have to like rebuild the code. So the values of the configuration parameters doesn't really affect the code. So they are separating the constants from the code files and putting it in a separate file, and they keep changing these files continuously, like maybe let's say 5-10 times or maybe 100 times a day. But the code is deployed just once, and the code will pick the value from the configuration file, whatever file is active at that point of time.
I can add to that a little bit. I'm Hitesh. I work for Microsoft as well, and I'm kind of part of some of the engineering systems that Sonu just talked about. So
Hitesh, please start your video if that's okay with you.
No problem.
Okay, let's see. Is this on? Can you guys see me?
Yeah.
Okay,
we are going
awesome.
to see that.
Okay, awesome. So typically what happens in kind of big systems at Microsoft, right? We separate the process of code deployment versus data deployment, right? So your big binaries, your code changes, right? They're all part of kind of, a specific release, and which happens at a specific cadence in most cases, right? The deployment that Sonu is talking about, this is something under the kind of umbrella of data deployment, which is like, minor configuration changes, feature flags and things like that, right? Where you want to basically switch from, let's say, a specific pool to another pool. You want to basically turn certain features on for certain customers and so on, right? So these deployments are like very cheap because essentially they are making kind of, platform changes, I would say, in some sense. The code which is deployed is more or less the same in most cases, because these configs, they talk to the kind of, larger, basically conditional framework inside the code itself, right? Solutions outside, in data deployments, and that's working well for us. Does that answer the question in some parts? Give you more context to it?
Yeah, it adds to whatever she said. But still, how without stopping the system, how we can make configuration changes to the ongoing system, that part still puzzles me.
I mean, I can answer this partially, this question. This is Ravindra. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm from TCS.
Yeah.
So in general, what happens is these kind of things are, there will be some kind of these constants are typically the configurations are some kind of constant, and they are typically considered in the code sets as read-only things. Okay. So these are deployed in some kind of caches that stay in the memory. So typically in the application servers are, in the application servers, they have some mechanism of caching. And when the system is coming up, these caches are loaded with the configurations. So there is also a cache. So application code, when they actually use these constants, they always refer to the cache and try to get the parameter. Okay, but when there are changes into the configuration parameters, there is a way to refresh the caches. Okay, these caches automatically get refreshed. They detect the code changes which are independent of program, and they get this fresh configuration, changed configurations are loaded to the cache. This is by either periodically done, or there will be a daemon which keep on detecting, pulling on the configuration directory to see any changes have been done. Based on that change, it will appropriately refresh the cache. Of course, there will be a time lag. It is not just always like the moment you change the configuration, it will be reflected in next immediately. There will be a slight time gap, but it get refreshed and come into the act, and then code on always refer whenever it requires a parameter, it will always refer because these code caches are some kind of hash sets. Whenever it reads code is, code does not care. All it gets is its parameters. This is the typical architecture of how these things in the deployment are done. Okay, this is a standard sort of technique people use, at least in the web applications or modern Java applications. There are several cache mechanisms available. There are very prominent caching systems. Typically, the constant data, tables, and all these things are cached for fast performances. Okay, these are application caching mechanisms.
I just wanted to add, if that means we are making changes to the configuration file, that means there was a bug in the earlier version and we are making the change. Is that right? Or
no, I think what she talked is when somebody made a change, there are dependent parameters. The developer or the user is supposed to make 3 changes. They made 2 changes, but they forgot the one more change because they have not fully understood the dependencies between these configuration files. So that resulted in a bug. That is what I think she addressed, Sonu addressed in her talk. How to find those dependencies and make sure that changes are consistent. That's what she, if I'm not wrong.
Yes, that's correct.
Right. I think, yes, so the discussion becomes slightly orthogonal to the problem that Sonu is solving, but at the same time, it's a very interesting and enlightening discussion. So are there other questions? I can see a hand raised by Nagalakshmi, so please go ahead.
Good afternoon, sir. Myself is Nagalakshmi from IIIT Bangalore. Okay, I have a question regarding this reconfiguration. Okay, so I'm working on IoT devices. So there is a necessary of this kind of reconfiguration with the sensor devices, since they are located remotely, where there is a frequently the code, whatever it is there in the deployed in the sensor devices, need to be reconfigured so frequently. So what kind of validation technique may be applicable for such kind of reconfiguration, or whatever the talk which is given by Sonu, can it be related with that? I need a hint or help from your side.
Yeah, so good question. I think so. Currently, we are not really worried about the validation part. So we do not really check if the change that was made by the developer is correct or not. We just check if the developer has made a change in the correlated file. So what you're talking about is, I think, is the next step for it. The next step is to kind of validate that the change made in file Y is what we expect it to be. Yes, I think we haven't done anything in that space. We are in the process of working in that area, but I probably would not be able to talk anything more about it because we are still in the initial stages. Yeah.
So because our work is on verification and validation of IoT systems only, so we started from the device level. So we got this topic over there. So
I see. Okay.
Right. I think what Devika is looking at is the file should be consistent. I don't think she's looking for bug and fixing the bugs. Right. So there is one more question by Divesh. Divesh, you want to ask it using your microphone?
Yeah, this is for Prantik. So I was wondering if verification condition generation can also be done in a distributed fashion.
Prantik, you are on mute.
Yeah, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So stratified inlining essentially employs a seagull. So that means it defines an abstraction of a program based on a counter example. So when you generate the VC of a program, you do not generate the VC of a program in a single go. Rather, you continually assert the procedural VCs as they happen to occur on the error trace. So essentially, when you verify the partitions in a distributed manner, you are also generating the VCs in a distributed manner as well.
Right. I see. Thanks for the clarification. Yeah.
Sorry, Amay, I'm butting in, but just a quick comment here. So imagine if you, Prantik, if you had the verification condition in full to start with, it can be viewed as a graph, right? And then if you were to generate this graph from scratch in a distributed manner, it's some sort of a graph partitioning that you would have to do, right? And that is known to be a difficult exercise. So
yeah, sure.
So this is Subodh, right? I just want to confirm.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. This is Subodh. Yes. Sorry.
Yeah, so we do not generate the VCs in a single go because that is like really expensive. So that will be a static VC generation problem. So rather we employ this seagull loop. Yeah, I guess we can also look at this as a graph partitioning problem and see whether we can distribute it.
So let me butt in. So I'm Subhajit here. So Subodh, actually we are doing a graph partitioning, but on the dynamic graph. So as the graph is evolving, it's sort of getting constructed in a distributed manner on the different lines.
Yeah. Thanks, Subhajit.
Yeah, so I see the interprocedural graph gets unrolled as you go, and it gets simultaneously checked for errors.
Right, and that happens on different lines, essentially unroll different parts of the graph.
I see, yeah.
So we are nearly close to the session, and I would like to thank all the speakers and also all the audience for asking very, very interesting questions. And this whole update meeting is, I think, presentations are a very small part of it. It's just to make sure that you know what is going on. But the idea is to get everyone together on the same platform. And in that sense, I think we have been very, very successful. I would like to thank IIIT Hyderabad for taking up this opportunity and setting up it so nicely. We had a few glitches, but I think all of you will understand. We are also doing it for the first time. And I would like to pass on the baton to Raghu. He has some announcements. So thank you all. I'm signing off now. Raghu, please go ahead.
Thank you, Amit. Thank you. It was a wonderful session. I mean, a lot of questions. So hopefully people get to know each other's work. That is the original intent, and start interacting with each other. So I do have a small announcement to make. This is coming from Meenakshi at IIIT Bangalore. So she wanted us to display this essentially. This is an event for women in computing. This is going to come up in about 10 days from now, I guess, or 15 days from now. So as many registrations as possible, and it is going to be a virtual event. So I guess stay at home just like now and still continue participating. So I would like to put this up for a few minutes. So people who are interested, especially women participants, please do go ahead and register. And the next session, we will probably start in about 10 minutes or so. So until then, have some coffee or something, and please do come back.
So Raghu, just, you can announce it clearly. So this is open to all. Even though the event says workshop for women, anyone can register. Non-women can also, men can also register.
I actually don't know the full details. Okay. Just maybe better to just talk to the organizers.
Okay, fine. Put the slide for break after a few. Thank you. Bye.
Hello. Hello, Raghu. Hello.